Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. Throughout the course of the American Revolution, the United States Army tended to suffer defeat after defeat. But, a huge part of the brilliance of the Commander-in-Chief George Washington was his ability to take punches and just keep on moving. While the Brits continually battered the American army year after year, they could never seem to deliver a knockout blow. Now, one of these especially brutal skirmishes came in the fall of 1777 in the fields of southeastern Pennsylvania in what would be known as the Battle of the Brandywine. Now, the battle is named for the waterway that cuts through the battlefield in southern Chester County, Pennsylvania, roughly 30 miles or so west of Philadelphia. In September of 1777, Washington led his regiment to the Brandywine Creek to meet the mighty British forces of General William Howe. Now, Philadelphia, which at this time was the most important city in the colonies and by all rights its capital, stood right behind the Americans, and the British were vying to take control of the city. You can see the importance of this battle as the capital city itself was at stake. Now, in an irony of history, September 11th proved actually to be a fatal day for these early Americans, much like it would be 224 years later in New York City and Washington, D.C. But on September 11th, 1777, Washington's forces met Howe's and were battered at the Brandywine. The Americans hoped to prevent the Brits from crossing the creek, using the natural barrier of the waterway as a home field advantage of sorts, but they failed to do so. General Howe succeeded in sneaking much of his army up against the American right flank. Now, using a tactic so common to the Americans, actually, Howe used the cover of the forest and the mist from the river to attack the American right side. Had Washington not responded so quickly, his army could have been destroyed, but he ordered a swift shore-up of his attacked right wing. And when it became clear that the U.S. Army could not win the day at Brandywine, he led a lightning-fast retreat into the woods. Now, this maneuver was a really tough call for General Washington because it forced him to leave Philadelphia exposed. Sure enough, the British marched the 30 miles across the Pennsylvania woods and took the capital city with very little resistance later in the fall of 1777. At Brandywine, the Americans suffered well over 1,000 casualties, with likely more than 200 killed. However, Washington's tough decision to give up the capital city actually proved to be a vital step towards freedom for the Americans, as the army was able to survive another day. Then in the winter of 1777 and 1778, the Americans encamped at Valley Forge to train and regroup. In the months that followed, the Americans did indeed regroup and won several key victories alongside a recapture of Philadelphia when the Brits just up and left. The victory at Yorktown several years later proved to be the catalyst in the American win, and the Treaty of Paris in 1783 confirmed the American victory in the struggle for independence. Thanks so much for joining me once again for A Moment in History.